Hi everyone, I'm Alexandria Martin. Today I'm going to focus on the letter of understanding, kind of like revamped and modified, and I want to just focus on some of those things that have been modified in the LOU. So let's get started. All right, so today I'm going to focus on in-school site contact investigations improvement. So how has that school site investigation when it comes to who should be quarantined, who shouldn't be quarantined, how has that improved? One first factor is the school bus situation. Some people wonder, do they factor in the child's commute if they were on a bus or not? Well, the LOU here says that they do. They have been, but it's now clearly defined that they must factor in the commute if that child was on a public transit um, school bus, right? The other thing they factor in is extracurricular activities and athletics. If they're in a team sport or if they are um, a part of an activity, after school activity, those things are factored in as well, and those kids should be notified and quarantined appropriately. Um, if there's other members in their household who are at another school site, those things I've heard the gamut of conversations at school board meetings about kids who've tested positive for COVID-19, but their sibling is testing negative and allowed to report to their various school sites, or that one sibling is quarantining and the other one's allowed to return to school. It's been a lot of conversation around that. So I'm glad to see the LOU addressing the fact that that should be factored into the conversation. Do they have siblings? Are they in another school within a different region or same region? And how can we address and mitigate that risk that's around that? So I'm glad to see that's in the LOU. Shall cover 48 hours prior to the test or initial onset of symptoms. That's an important conversation too. Um, it's been a large conversation around when do we factor in the dangers and around the COVID positivity. Are we just looking at the day that person tests positive and saying, okay, those teachers must quarantine? Or are we just looking at the 24 hours before? How far do we go back? So I'm glad to see it's going back 48 hours, which means for especially for high schools that we're factoring in their block scheduling, that they have their 2, 4, 6, 8 teachers one day and their 1, 3, 5, 7 teachers another day, and that all those teachers need to be factored in as well as the students um, into the conversation about quarantining. So I'm glad to see that language is in there. Um, let's see. The next thing here is about investigating, expanding to substitutes and itinerant personnel. That's important. There are substitutes who come to our building and then go to someone else's building. It's important that we keep track of them, let them know, maybe you've been exposed to someone who's COVID-19 positive, and mitigate the concern of just spreading around the entire district region, because substitutes are very transient. Itinerant personnel as well, that they could be at a work site and not properly notified and then transfer them what could be COVID positivity to another work site. So I'm glad this conversation is being addressed as well. Sanitation posting. It's been a big conversation for me. I've had an opportunity to speak to school board members regarding this conversation about sanitation. How do we know it's truly being sanitized? How do we know that our classrooms, that hallway, the spaces to which they say that someone was COVID positive in has been thoroughly sanitized the way it should? It talks about here, it should be hung in areas of the school that are sanitized. So we now know that there will be signs up posting saying that this particular place has been COVID-19 sanitized. So that I find some comfort in that, having that visibly available for me to see and people at my work site, and hopefully you'll feel the same way about your work site. For contact for those exposed must happen within 24 hours. It's presumed that normally, I think most work sites try to get it in between a 24-hour window, but it's good to see the language that they can exceed 24 hours, because I think that's important that people are notified as timely as possible. Itinerant and substitute personnel who are just at the work site doesn't mean that they actually were exposed to someone COVID-19 positive, but that they were just there when this was happening. I'm glad to see that they're being notified as well. They're being notified that they may have come in contact with someone who's COVID-19. They've been in the building, I should say, let me rectify that, in the building where someone's had a COVID-19 positivity. Doesn't mean they actually were exposed to it or that they should quarantine, but the notification, just like everyone else at the work site for those days, received. I'm glad to see that itinerant personnel and substitutes are getting that notification also. Additionally, this language here, I think, is really important to clarify the who clears a student and who clears an employee. So when it comes to a student testing positive, they must self-isolate, and they're not really allowed to return back until the Florida Department of Health gives the appropriate clearance for them to return. Whereas an employee's return is determined by the school district. They must self-isolate for 14 days, and they cannot return to work without a medical clearance if they tested positive. So that and I bolded there because I thought that was pretty important. That you need to have both. You have to have 14 days of self-isolation, and you must have medical clearance to return to work. So those two things are required for employees. Um, Additionally, the decision to pivot is based on, in part, the following factors. So I've wondered, how do we determine when we should pivot to MSO? How many students or individuals have to, what's the threshold? What has to happen in order for us to transfer from face-to-face instruction to online instruction? So there's some guidance here. It's not the full database here, but it does give us an idea. The number of confirmed COVID-19 cases linked or unlinked to students and staff is something that they factor in. Potential exposure to other students and employees. Ability to sanitize the school prior to the return of the students and staff. They can't sanitize everything in a timely fashion. They probably should close down the building and do that correctly. Potential, well, they should, no, probably do it. They should do that. Potential outbreak in community factors. That if there's just an outbreak in the community, that's something that needs to be factored into whether it's safe for students to come to the school site and not increase the spread. So those are some factors that really determine should we pivot to completely MSO at a particular work site. So the last few things I wanted to point out is the tech connecting to the dashboard and certain information around that. The dashboard will have cases of those physically present students and employees who self-reported positivity. So that kind of clarifies the dashboard for me. It's really about the physical students. It doesn't tell you how many MSO students are COVID positive. And honestly, I would like to have seen the numbers about quarantining, how many people are quarantined in any individual building. Maybe we'll eventually get there, but this isn't interesting to know. That's just the positivity rate within the individuals physically reporting and not those who are MSO. If a school has a majority of non-MSO population quarantined, the school principal, in consultation with the school operations, will determine if a school shall pivot to MSO for the duration of the quarantine period. So a majority of non-MSO population quarantined is what is a trigger to whether or not we should move into a MSO instructional situation. So majority to me is more than 50%. But of course, this conversation it happens in consultation with the principal, and the school operations makes a determination along with all the other factors I mentioned on the other side of it, being able to clean and how many people are exposed. All those things factor in to the determination of whether if a school site is going to pivot to MSO. And the last thing is the decision will be communicated to the designated building steward before communicating this to the staff. So if there's any designated building stewards like myself watching this, it's important to know you should be notified before the general staff is notified. And someone might be asking, well, why is that important? Well, that does allow for conversations to happen between the designated building steward and the work site principal to really talk about, how this can be effectively done, and communication can be had between two parties that have a lot invested in the well-being of the staff and students who work there. So a lot could be accomplished by having that conversation. And I think both parties can be helpful to each other. So I will do future videos on other changes to the LOU when it comes to quarantining. That'll be the next one. But I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about in-school site contact investigation and improvements. So I really hope this has been helpful to you guys. And Feel free to check out my previous videos if you haven't already done so. Take care.